Thanks for being with us today on Shine FM for another edition of Journey Living with Shannon Meyer. The foundation of Journey Living Ministries is Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Journey Living is a radio broadcast featuring the Bible teaching of Shannon Meyer. Shannon's passion is to help women walk with God through the trials and challenges of life. Speaking from her own life experiences and a biblical foundation, Shannon offers women hope that God does have a plan, even when we don't see it. Now here's Shannon with today's teaching.
How many of you have been keeping up with the latest craze of superhero movies? It all started way back when with Batman and Robin, or Superman, years ago. But now it seems there's a new superhero every 6 months, along with their villains, who are perched high above on the IMAX screen, and we're all captivated by their heroism to save the day, along with the entire world from death and destruction. Although Batman was my all-time favorite because I grew up in the era where we got to see him go to the Batcave and come out in his Batmobile and to Gotham City and clean up all that the Joker had tried to destroy. He was cloaked in black with his cape in flight to rescue any and all who were in distress. I even still have one of the original Batmobiles, and it is a treasure of one of my greatest childhood memories. I love that. But he was always the good guy ridding our world of evil. Now that I'm older, and there have been dozens of new renditions made, I would have to say our world looking as it does, with the threat of another terrorist attack at any given moment, Iron Man has become one of my new faves because we can all relate to what that looked like with the terrorist. So for anybody that hasn't watched it, check it out sometime on Netflix, but I'll give you the quick context. It was brought out in 2008, and it tells the story of Tony Stark, a billionaire industrialist and a genius inventor who's kidnapped and forced to build a devastating weapon. Instead, using his intelligence and ingenuity, Tony builds a high-tech suit of armor and escapes captivity. When he uncovers a despicable plot with global implications, he dons his powerful armor and vows to protect the world as Iron Man. So if you've caught the movie yourself, you know how he was tortured to nearly death, making him more inspired and apt to save the world if he could withstand the wrath of his villainous counterparts. The beatings, being shocked with high volts of electricity currents, and near drownings left him helpless. This weapons genius found the strength and the power to begin and bring himself to a place in his mind and heart to turn this evil into good. Now, while we're all in our homes, comfy in our lazy boys, in the safety of our own house, we cheer and root for the superhero who is taken to near death to come back alive and whip the enemy to the ground. And we can cheer on the good guys and have a great experience in watching larger than life on any screen. But what happens when this is what our life looks like? What happens when we feel as though the enemy has just brought us to our knees, to near death, and has our heads held underwater, and we say, let me just lay here and die? I'm not a superhero, and I'm not in the movies. And no one is paying me millions of dollars to play this part either. Well, I do know just how you feel. I've often had these times in my life, more than not, where I felt as though one more blow to my family, my finances, my health, or even my relationships, and I was going to be down for the count. And I was not getting back up. But one character above all else in the Bible mirrors such a superhero to me. He, ironically, is the one person who I can relate to the most. And all of you have probably heard about him. It's Joseph. Now, this is not Jesus' earthly father, Joseph, that was with Mary. This was Joseph, the son of Jacob. Let me share this little context with you for somebody who might not be familiar. Joseph was the youngest of 11 other brothers. He was very confident. Some would say too confident. He knew he was Jacob's favorite, his father, and he flaunted it foolishly in front of his not impressed older brothers. His youthful pride cost him greatly. His brothers had had enough of him, and when he announced after having a dream that they all would someday bow down and worship him, Well, his brothers didn't take kindly to his ludicrous babblings, and they made every effort to get rid of him. So after throwing him in a pit and stripping him of his coat of many colors that Jacob had made for him, they eventually sold him into slavery to never be seen again. Although Joseph, needless to say, was puffed up and very arrogant, he also really didn't deserve the harsh punishment that he received from his brothers. After Jacob, his father, had received word that something ferociously had torn his beloved son to shreds, he tore his own cloak and put on sackcloth and mourned for several days, the Bible says, which would have been the custom. He was devastated, thinking his young son was dead. Little did Joseph's brothers tell their father that they had simply dipped his coat into goat's blood to only cover up their own story of throwing him into the pit, leaving him for dead. Little did they know that that dream that Joseph told them about, although arrogant, they certainly would bow down and worship their younger brother again someday. Maybe today you're wrestling with the wrong that has been done to you. Maybe by a family member or a spouse. Maybe it's been by your own boss or coworker, or maybe a sibling, just like Joseph. You too were only young and naive, and you really didn't mean any harm, but they took it the wrong way, and now you find yourself in a pit, so to speak. Maybe it's a pit of despair or depression. Maybe it's a pit where you have been ostracized from your family and you are deemed the black sheep. Maybe you didn't always make the right choices, and now you're paying for that choice for the rest of your life. And there is no shortage of anyone reminding you of just how wrong you were. Well, let me just assure you today that you're in good company if it makes you feel any better. And today, if you are one of these people or feel a lot like Joseph, like I do, then stay with me for the next few minutes because I have some great and encouraging news just for you. Believe it or not, there is something boundless that can happen inside of you if you will allow it. Just like the hardship that Joseph endured while living in a pit, or even like Iron Man did while being left in the hands of his captors, transformation happens. There is a little tiny verse found in Psalms chapter 4, verse 1 that can revolutionize your life if you will simply let it. Reading from the King James Version is the best way to get its truest meaning. Some of the other versions, you may miss it because of one word. So let me tell it to you. It says, "Thou hast enlarged me while I was in distress." Now, for some, that may not hit home very hard or be very impressive, but let me show you its true meaning as David writes this psalm. Some say this is one of the greatest testimonies ever written regarding the effectiveness of God's work during hard times of difficulty. David is saying that the distress in his life has set him free, not from the suffering, but through the suffering. And there is a big difference, friends. Isn't it true that what doesn't kill us does make us stronger? I know I used to hate that saying, but it really is a true one. And I even bought the sign that says I can't tell if this is killing me or making me stronger, and it's hung up in my office. Even songs now have been written. Joseph is the poster child for this saying. He really does deserve all the royalties if they were ever to have any. There is a famous saying about when Joseph was thrown into the dungeon, and that is, iron entered his soul. How many of you would change your thinking about your terrible circumstance if you could realize that the very place you despise and resent could be the very place where iron has entered your soul? I know once I learned this for myself, it has truly set me free. It has set me so free that even though I have made mistakes, I know that they'll be worked out for my good, or even that other people have terribly mistreated me. I know this, that God was with me every moment of those terrible times. And even though the enemy meant all harm for my suffering, God has turned them for good. It truly is a swing in the pendulum of thinking when you wrap your head around it. And although this world may not have been the world that you have planned for yourself or your own life, God was going to do something amazing with it and make you strong, just like iron, if you would just let him do that. He will do more than you could ever think or imagine. You see, Joseph needed some hard knocks to knock that arrogance right out of him. I too have needed those right along with him. And some of you, if you were brutally honest, would say the exact same thing, that you are better for what God has allowed in your life to humble you and to take you from someone who is prideful into someone who has been broken and truly understands what it is like to suffer. You now have empathy for those who are hurting instead of making snide remarks or telling them they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and just get over it. You now have the empathy that Jesus wants you to have. Because once you've been placed into the pit to be purified, you will never, and I mean never, be the same. It's a privilege, as you will see, when God takes you by the hand and allows you to be made into something that you would never imagine to bring glory to the kingdom of God. Maybe you too have had a youthful spirit and have been living in your dreams of what your life should be. Maybe you shouldn't have known any hard times, or you only want to live in a fantasy world. And maybe nothing catastrophic has ever dawned your doors of your life or even your family's doors. And you would rather live in the clouds instead of in the reality of the real world. And I get that. I know people like that. But what's different is when you see something that is bothersome or where someone may be in need, do you quickly turn your head and go in the opposite direction so they're not to interfere with your whimsical kind of life? Well, this is exactly how Joseph lived when he was younger. He was a dreamer. And no, I'm not just saying that dreaming is bad, because we know that God wants us to have dreams. But it is not good for us to stay there. And if those dreams don't come to fruition, well, we fall apart. There's a great proverb that I've made to memory that says, if you fall apart during a crisis, there wasn't much to you anyways. And that is really true. Or maybe you're a train wreck over a simple romance and you give up eating and sleeping. You can't work or reason. That means when something really important comes your way, you're not going to make it. Iron is what makes the distress in our life worthwhile. It's what makes us stronger. And it's what David says in Psalms 4. It's what enlarges our lives. There's a great sentence I came across while studying for this very message, and it says, the common touch of humanity that gives the world true kinship is not joy, but sorrow. Gold is partial to only a few. Iron is universal. That, again, is a fact of life. Most everyone knows sorrow. It is through our shared suffering that we can only have compassion for one another. Joseph's road to the palace had to begin in the pit. There was no other way. Your road to glory will take you through the pit of hell at times, so that you will know what it is like that you are so desperately trying to keep others from. Joseph's shackles are what ultimately set him free. He may have started out as a prisoner, but there was no mistake that those ironclads that kept him from becoming more in his own eyes than he thought is the iron that grew strong within him to make him be the governor over Egypt and save thousands and thousands of people from a time of famine. You may think the very thing that has you bound and that you will never be free from and keeps you as a daily prisoner could be the very thing that God will cause you to rise up in a time when no one else is available with your kind of strength, and you may do things that you never thought were ever possible. But only by God's grace were you able to be made into an iron man or iron woman. I came across a really old poem that fits this so well. It says, life is not as idle ore, but iron dug from central gloom and heated hot with burning fears and dipped in baths of hissing tears and battered by the shocks of doom to shape and use. I know that's old and maybe kind of hard to follow, but it talks about that iron that we can only find in the depths of our soul when it's the most gloomy and sorrowful, is the iron that will strengthen us to someday be so strong. So many of our lives start out with great dreams and visions for a better tomorrow. But most know that those dreams are quickly dashed as the reality of life sets in and we are knocked off course by the waves of circumstance in the ever-changing tide. We keep telling ourselves that things will get better and we hope that life will get easier. But the older we get and the wiser we become, we realize that that is simply the dream of a fool. So we have to ask ourselves at some point in time, is this all worth it? And for what? Why must we endure a life of hardship and tragedy? Well, let me read to you a passage again out of the Psalms. This is all not for nothing. It's found in Psalm 105, verse 16 through 22, and I'll be reading out of the Message. And it starts out with this. Then he called down a famine on the country. He is God. He broke every last blade of wheat. But he sent a man on ahead, Joseph, sold as a slave. They put cruel chains on his ankles and an iron collar around his neck until God's word came to the Pharaoh and God confirmed his promise. God sent the king to release him. The Pharaoh set Joseph free. He appointed him master of his palace, put him in charge of all his business, to personally instruct his princes and train his advisors in wisdom. Now, let me just back up here to verse 18 because the Hebrew word for neck really is soul in this verse. So remember where it says an iron collar around his neck? That verse really means his soul came into iron. A verse or a phrase that ancient Jewish translators interpreted to mean iron entered his soul. Some may say that Joseph's life was cursed from the beginning since this was Jacob's favorite son. He was certainly ostracized by the other 11 brothers. And if things were not already bad enough, Joseph went and made a spectacle of himself by flaunting these dreams that God had already given him. It even says in Genesis 37, verse 8, they hated him all the more because of his dreams and words. Joseph needed a lesson in his words. Knowing when to shut it down would have been a really good one for him, or knowing when to use the filter over his mouth. But we got to remember this. God has a great way of seeing way beyond our inadequacies and looking to the future of what we can become more than where we are today. And I am so thankful he does that with me on a daily basis. Aren't you? Here's something you might not know about this whole story. You see, there was something called the Canaanite culture. Even Judah, being the best, was buying into their corrupt and immorality of the land. It was necessary for God to extract the family from Canaan to cure them of its corruption. But before God could prepare a place for his people, he had to prepare a man for that place. Joseph needed to be prepared. The time of preparation is vital to anyone's success. And one of the greatest pictures of that for me, and many of you know, I got to travel to Paris Island last year to watch the making of a Marine. It was an intensive process and one I will never forget as long as I live, because those young men and women are prepared for battle. For 13 weeks, they are stripped of any outside influences. They are retaught to walk, talk, and carry themselves worthy of being called a Marine. They are made into soldiers. Their time of preparation is vital to their survival as well as their training to save and protect we Americans in time of war and crisis. And at times it was so very hard for me to watch. Some of the new recruits had just left the comforts of their mother's arms. They had just graduated high school and had been coddled for the last 17 years of their life. They knew nothing of long days and sleepless nights. They never knew what it was like to have only a few minutes to shower and eat, and to learn to use weapons and survive in the cruelest of conditions. But one thing was certain when I loaded that plane for home. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that those young men and women had been prepared to fight for our freedom. I was never more proud to be an American and to watch the making of the greatest military in the world. I met 21 and 22-year-olds with more credentials than most 40 or 50-year-olds. They had been made to lead and make decisions that you and I will probably never, ever have to do. They were prepared to do great things for the world and for all of humanity. And I can guarantee you this, there was probably a never greater feeling than the one of one graduating and knowing that they had endured and it was all worth it. They had certainly earned the right to be called the few, the proud, the Marines. Oswald Chambers says this about God's preparation: it is definite, it is drastic, and it is destructive. And that was certainly true for Joseph's life, and probably true for many of yours. I know it has been for mine. But one thing always remained the same through his entire life, and we can read that in Genesis 39, verses 2 and 3, and again in verse 21. It says that God was with him. I'm sure there are things in your life that you would never have dreamed of happening to you, just like Joseph. He had one event after another come tumbling down on him that seemed as though it was a never-ending parade of a nightmare. The pit, the prison, and even the palace were probably not thoughts that he had ever thought about for his life when he was young and naive and taunting his brothers with his infamous coat of many colors that his father had made for him. Many of you have seen that great movie, Chariots of Fire, where it depicts a time of inspiration and passion to rise up. Eric Little, missionary, writes, "Circumstances may appear to wreck our lives and God's plans, but God is not helpless among the ruins." That quote made it to my own war room. We should write that until that becomes like iron in our soul. I'm going to say it one more time. Circumstances may appear to wreck our lives and God's plan, but God is not helpless among the ruins. Read it, learn it, and know it so that it is seared into your being, always reminding you that no matter what the circumstance that you think has wrecked your life or has even ruined your plans for a better tomorrow, God is not helpless amongst your ruins, ever, ever. God is always, always, always working all things out for our good. I know that it's often hard to believe in the midst of a crisis, but if we can get a hold of this, it will make all the difference in our world. When I got a hold of that iron has entered my soul through my sufferings that I've endured, I feel like I stood up a little taller. I spoke a little bit more confidently, and I led with a higher standard, and I watched for every opportunity that crossed in front of me, whether good or bad. God had made it that it was going to be for my betterment. Ephesians 1:11 reminds us that in him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. That is such good news, friends. All that means is that God is working everything, and I mean everything, out for his purpose and for you. But we must remember that even when evil comes, he is working it all out in love for us. Think about our friend Job, of course. Satan ran him through the ringer, and yet in the end, God had a greater plan for him to be used for his glory. Job gives us all hope that we can make it no matter how much the enemy throws our way. Jacob, Joseph's father, even cries out in Genesis 42:36 that everything is against me. But in God's economy, he has another plan for us. Even Joseph's father was crying in his distress. We would do well to allow iron to enter our souls through our distress. Friends, God is strengthening our souls with each passing wave that threatens to take us under. If we can remember to allow God to do his work in us and through us, we will come out on top. We will be able to take on challenges that we never thought possible. Who knows? God may use you to save a family, a church, a school, a government, or even a nation. Don't despise the time of suffering. God is allowing iron to enter your soul. Inevitably, this will enlarge you and make you even greater. Let your shackles be the wings that ultimately will set you free, just like Joseph. No matter where you sit today, whether that be in the pit, in a prison, whether that be literally or in your living room floor, or maybe even if you live in the palace, let God strengthen your soul and allow the iron to reinforce all that God has for you. Who knows? You too may become put into a position that will change the world. Won't you take the time to allow God to do that in your life today? I sure hope so.
thank you for being with us for this edition of Journey Living with Shannon Meyer. If you'd like to hear this program again or learn more about Journey Living Ministries or even contact Shannon, her website is journeylivingministries.org. Shannon also teaches a Bible study for women on Tuesday nights at 7 at Union Station in Bellefontaine, and she's also available to speak at events. And we'd love for you to join us again next Thursday morning at 9 for Journey Living with Shannon Meyer on Shine FM.